So good evening and welcome back. As we see the protest gain in prominence, statues are now being targeted. Statues for which the protesters really don't understand what they are there to stand for, what they are there to solidify. The idea of any statue is to show a reminder of the history of the place of where it's at. And yes, of course, statues are used to commemorate dictators and despots in countries around the world, and after they are overthrown, then of course their statues are torn down. Not ignoring that at all. But for the regular day-to-day occurrences in civilized countries for centuries gone by, the statues are there to understand this was someone who had a big effect during the time. And therefore, they are there to serve as a reminder of what the past is of the country or the particular location. And it could be, of course, to say, here was somebody who followed the moral code of the day, and perhaps if we use revisionist history, we can see that they had flaws which they weren't aware of as flaws at the time, but at the time they were around, they did very well. And it was down to them that they engineered the country or the location in a positive direction. And we are grateful for that. We're grateful for the good that they did. Nobody's perfect. We understand people make mistakes. We understand that people's intentions, although being well-intentioned, that they might not understand the consequences of their actions. But on a whole, if we average things out, if there was a great net positive, then it's worth respecting that. But understanding that no matter what we think we know, how good we think we might be as any individual, that, of course, time is an unforgiving mistress. And just like in your own life, you'll look back at things which you thought were good at the time, but will now fill you with a great sense of guilt or shame and just kind of anxiety, and just feel that regret and just how bad that feels, understanding that you had a missed opportunity. But that is what made you who you are. Just like these people, in a broader sense, are what made the locations what they are. And the statues are there to showcase that. But, of course, the largely university student protesters don't understand this, because of course they wouldn't. This isn't the kind of thing they get taught at university. Instead, because of Marxist subversion, they are largely indoctrinated into Marxist ideology, into race-baiting and class-based privilege, or even worse, race-based privilege. And why, of course, there are now petitions to say white privilege must be essential reading for school children in order to just understand that white people are clearly inherently evil. Obviously, they are responsible for lifting the world out of poverty and making the world a much better place than it was, and ending slavery around the world. But we can't focus on the good things, of course. We've got to focus on the bad until every country turns into someone like Liberia and just ends up as a wasteland, as we see in the vast majority of African countries, especially Liberia. If we leave out the intervention, then that is what ends up. And that seems to be something that these people really don't understand at all. Otherwise, if they wish to point fingers of modern-day slavery, then of course go into the Islamic world, of which their slave trade has lasted over 1,000 years longer than the Atlantic slave trade, and is still practiced today in places like Sudan. Or, of course, you can move over to China if you wish to go to somewhere where the racism is actually common and can be seen overtly, and, of course, people are discriminated against with prejudice, not just based on race, but also based on religion, like Islam. If you wish to go down that route, then by all means do so. But pushing against this open door, as they say, is not helping anyone. Instead, it is destroying things which are not yours, not your property at all. It is destroying things of which the upkeep costs the taxpayer, and the protesters here are largely non-taxpayers. So instead, because they're most likely earning less than £32,000 per year, they are net takers from the state. Bear in mind that all you taxpayers as well, which I'm sure that the vast majority, if not all of my listeners on this are, you are paying for the so-called education at these universities, the indoctrination, which then causes people to do this. So the government is taking your money in order to do things which you probably don't appreciate, and to do some things which you might. And with that money, they are also then using it to indoctrinate people, the young, malleable minds, into believing things to tear down those few things the government does which you support. And you're paying for the whole thing. That is what your money is being used for. And I understand that student loans are loans, so of course the students pay them back, but no, they don't. Only half pay anything back, and only about somewhere between 13 and 17% will actually pay it all back over their lifetime. So it is largely a waste. And you know, of course, which courses are a waste. So getting back to the news of the day, and in particular these statues. So the two main ones which have been focused on are, of course, Winston Churchill and Edward Colston. And this is just the lasting reminder, essentially, of riots which have turned more violent, leading to 27 police injured. So, as we see here from this short clip, we see the Edward Colston statue being brought down, as well as the riots becoming more aggressive in London. So, of course, this is supposed to be a thing about going against police brutality, despite, of course, having the police on the run, as we could see here, as well as during this, of course, one of the police officers does get kicked in the back by that thug there. As is to be expected, that apparently the police are far too brutal and yet are being pushed back and the police are visibly retreating. Meanwhile, of course, the protesters are throwing, as they say, bottles and other objects, including a bicycle and a firecracker. And the things with bottles is, of course, you don't know what's in them. That it could be a water bottle filled with quick-drying cement, for example, and now it becomes a brick, and they are just throwing bricks. There are all sorts of things that can be within water bottles. So, when they say bottles, you've really got to think about what could be in them. And, of course, it could also be a glass bottle, and then it's not far throw to then do Molotov cocktails, as they're very easy to do. Cotton shirt, petrol, glass bottle, easy. Very straightforward, seeing as the protesters don't seem to be afraid of pyrotechnics anyway, and they know that they won't be arrested. I think we've had 3 arrests, and that's it. Fewer arrests than police officers injured, which really doesn't make sense. So the Prime Minister, in response, said that, well, he believed the UK was a much less racist society now than it was 40 years ago. He said he heard the Black Lives Matter protesters and accepted much more needed to be done to ensure everyone was treated equally. We must also frankly acknowledge that there was so much more to do in eradicating prejudice and creating opportunity, and the government I lead is committed to that effort. In short, no. No, Conservatives, you really don't have to. The statistics bear it out that if you want to bring race into it, then, as I've said before, you're 25% more likely to be killed in police custody if you're white. However, you could say, oh, but you're more likely to be arrested if you're black. It's like, yeah, or put another way, you're more likely to be arrested if you're a criminal. Funny how that works. And then the use of force is more likely if you're resisting arrest. And more of a violent criminal. This actually makes perfect sense. If you wish to bring race into it, then you'll have to answer that very inconvenient 1350 meme. Or 1352, if you will. Or in London, you could say 1366, if you wish to put it down to knife crime. Because you can pick your own little statistic you want. But it basically comes out to 1350. That's what we're looking at. You could do 6.5 if you want to just say the men. Or you can reduce it if you just want to say the young men, So you could say about 3% basically, and you could say 350 if you felt that way inclined. But in terms of course, there are lower standards for university, there are quotas, there are scholarships available to only black people, there are quotas in the workplace as well, of course, where you have your forced diversity hire, whereby somebody's hired because they're black and not because they're any good, for example. So if he's really looking to try to treat everybody equally, then he would say, here we are, Black Lives Matter, and let's look into it. And, I see, we're giving black people too many rights, and we should really reduce the social welfare amongst the black community and stop these quotas and reduce the amount of opportunities you're getting, because you're getting far more than anybody else. Just like we saw with, I believe it was Google, with their internal review of thinking that men were getting paid more than women, but it turned out that women were getting paid more, and therefore the men had to have a pay rise and the women had to have a pay cut. That they don't actually understand what they're on about, and they just push this narrative so much, and the media is shameful in doing the same thing, the legacy media, that they then encourage these actions without realizing what the truth is of it at all. I'm glad that we have finally been able to push past the earnings gap between men and women, but now it seems that we wish to go back to race again. I thought we'd gotten over this by now, seeing as black people do have more rights than white people in the UK, but apparently no, not yet. So, of course, we did see the pulling down statue of a slave trader, Edward Colston. Bristol slave trader statue was an affront. This slave trader, why was there a statue of this slave trader in the first place? So Edward Colston, the Mayor Marvin Rees, the Mayor of Bristol, said he felt no sense of loss after the controversial bronze statue of Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into the harbour by protesters on Sunday. So he was a merchant during the 18th century, the late 18th century, and lived until the early 19th century, and was a God-fearing conservative, essentially, and did work his way up the ranks in the Royal African Company, as they say here, member of the Royal African Company, and then became deputy, which was the highest office in the Royal African Company at the time. We said which transported about 80,000 men, women, and children from Africa to the Americas, and a problem with the ships, and one that he wanted to improve, was the fatality rate, that many people died on the way over to America after they'd been bought from the African warlords, because of course Africa enslaved each other before Britain put a stop to it and outlawed slavery essentially around the world and forced that upon Africa as well. I know, British colonialism, outlawing slavery, it must be terrible, but that is what happened, and Colston was of course concerned and tried to help decrease the fatality rate, increase the survival rate, because quite often as well that you'd have the crew having a higher mortality rate than the slaves, because of course the slaves were being transferred over, but their crew were working and therefore at higher risk, and you'd have more crew dying than the slaves. Not something that's mentioned often, obviously not. So, as they say, on his death in 1721, he bequeathed his wealth to charities, and his legacy can still be seen on Bristol streets, memorials and buildings, including hospitals, schools, almshouses which are essentially for the poor, the downtrodden, the indigent, if you will, mainly a Christian-run thing as well. So how much was it? It was £70,000, which in today's money is about £14 million that he donated. But of course, if you want to actually have a more accurate view and not just use inflation, but use real terms, relating it to the GDP to understand, well, okay, how much spending power was that? How much did that mean in real terms? In today's money, taking the same percentage of the GDP, that would be £9 billion that he put into Bristol. That's how much he gave away. That is why he was called a philanthropist. That is why there was so much around Bristol because of him. He wasn't the sole architect of Bristol, of course, but he is responsible for Bristol being the city that it is today. It was down to Edward Colston. That is why there was a statue of him. But these students, of course, don't get told any of this, because why would they? That might be useful and enlightening, but instead just, slave trader, bad, without actually considering the full facts of the matter. So as Mr. East, the mayor, says, I can't and won't pretend the statue of a slave trader in a city I was born and grew up with wasn't an affront to me and people like me. People in Bristol who don't want the statue in the middle of the city came together, and it is my job to unite, hear those voices, and hold those truths together for people for who that statue is a personal affront. As an elected politician, obviously I cannot condone the damage, and I am very concerned about the implications of a mass gathering and the possibility of a second COVID wave. So basically he said, I agree with you, I understand what you're doing, and it's my job to support you. But obviously I can't condone it, if you know what I mean. But I'm not going to stop you, because he didn't let the police step in, and instead told the police to step down and just allow it to happen. So, unbelievably, without any sense of realisation at all from the BBC, they've got why the statue had to come down. And we've got Salma Omar, who said she would tell her children about the day Edward Colston's statue fell, because protests in Bristol on Sunday described seeing Colston's statue being toppled as empowering. Some of those who saw it fall told the BBC why they felt it was right for it to pull down. And so you've got someone who's clearly an immigrant, clearly not indigenous to Britain, clearly has nothing to do whatsoever with Edward Colston or the history of Bristol, but instead moved here from another country and just wants to see the landmarks taken down, just wants to see the people who built the city removed, just wants to replace all of British history with something that suits her own sensibilities more from her own country. She wishes to import her own culture into a new country. And if that isn't textbook colonising, which I know the left seem to hate so much, then I don't know what is. So the double standard here and the lack of realisation from the BBC is ridiculous. Trying to push this message of saying, it's a good thing that somebody who wasn't from here really likes destroying the property here. We should really encourage more of these people, shouldn't we? So how do they not see it? And of course we've got Churchill's statue, being lined out, saying was a racist, saying fuck you, different things taped to him, different banners put up as well, and therefore the following day they had 4 volunteers to scrub it off, followed by a member of the council to wash it off. Again, all down to taxpayer expense, because City can't govern for anything, really. Not at all. And the one time that the police did get involved was when one member of the crowd found those posters on and thought, well, I can get rid of those, and did take them off into the crowd. And that is who the police then decided to follow. Because, hey, you can't have them trying to stop the graffiti. That clearly can't be acceptable. But we see this all around. And there's another classic one which they like to spray paint on, which is ACAB, which is all cops are bastards. Suggesting anywhere around the world, no matter where, no matter who, no matter when, that yes, all cops are bastards. Because, I kid you not, and I'm just going to tap into this briefly, that the Democrats have actually decided to go ahead with this, to introduce a sweeping legislation to reform police, because there has been a long-running theme over the past few decades to defund the police and to disband the police. And that is what the Democrats are trying to get at here. And that is what the demands are of the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK as well, under obviously no standing whatsoever. But just as a contrast, it is nice to see that in America, of course, they have the curfew. They've brought in the National Guard. They've been able to get more normality back to the places where the National Guard has been brought in. And they said, this is the curfew. If you're not inside at that point, you will be pushed inside. It is that simple. It is really that simple. And they have done that, and they have been successful in doing so. In the UK, of course, we have not seen that. The police have not been given that authority, given that right, and instead people have come outside to protest about a problem that is non-existent. The only demand I can see is that they want to get rid of the police. That is it. As we see, stop police brutality in the background here. Their only demand is to get rid of the police. And we're not going to do that. Put simply, situations like this where the police are quite necessary, if they are then causing damage and violence to personal property and also to public property, as Boris Johnson is trying to say, do it the more democratic way. This is why we have votes. If the rioters do not wish to abide by that, that is where we have law and order to step in and deal with them in order to make sure that other people can be safe. The idea of the police is to serve and protect, or protect and serve, and they are not doing that here. And that is what needs to come back. So if the only demand from these communities is no police, I would say that's probably a bit of a tall order. And do you think we can compromise a bit more? If you're saying police reform, what is it that you want? You want to let blacks run free? Fine. In that case, you'll need to find a place, preferably outside of the UK, which you can just devote to black people and let them run amok and do whatever they want. And if one country isn't enough, why not a whole continent? Why not actually say, hey, we understand Britain is such a racist country and it's so bad and so evil, and clearly we can't do anything on our own, as we've seen a clap for heroes and saying that the NHS is full of foreign workers. So seeing as we're so bad, let's get you on one of these metal birds, they're called planes, white people made them, and fly you to a country that is full of like-minded people who don't like the police and don't have a police force, and their rule of law is very different out there as well, and it's all black as well, so you don't have to worry about any racism, and you can go over there. We can even pay for the flight for you as well, so there's no cost to you. You get to go to a better place for free. We're not locking you in any camps, we're not holding you back, nothing like that. We're offering you free travel to a better place, because clearly our country is too backward, too white, and you need to go to a blacker country. Easy. And the same goes with the white protesters here as well. You know, obviously if Britain is racist and such an evil place, then they can go to South Africa, by all means. Please go. Really, please do. And I really hope that there will be enough hypocrisy, ridiculousness shown by these protests that maybe the next time the voting comes round, we might see a slight difference, because although the vocal minority are speaking out here, the silent majority are absolutely sick of this. Bear in mind, the vast majority of people have a positive view of Churchill as well. So this will not stand. And if the police don't do anything, then obviously it is down to the individuals to do so. We don't have the Second Amendment over here, but as I said before, I guarantee you, right-wingers will always overpower left-wingers. The reason being, left-wingers are weak, always appeal to authority, and can't do anything themselves. Right-wingers understand that the world is difficult, need to train, need to practice, need to get better, so that if times are tough, if the danger is there, the opportunity presents itself, you can capitalize on it, keep yourself safe and the ones you love safe, because you know it's the right thing to do. Left-wingers are weak and will flail and fall apart. Right-wingers have trained for these moments, will know what to do, and will come out on top. So as I said before, left-wingers, before you want to start a civil war or a race war, just understand who you're up against. But until next time, everybody else, stay safe, keep training, because you might need it. But most of all, have a good one.